Okay, this is a lecture for March 24th. I apologize for not being there. I won't be there this week or next week. As I said in the email to you guys, my mom had multiple strokes. She's lost most of her neural ability, so we've had her removed to the hospital back home to her home so she can pass in the most comfort in a place that she feels comfortable. So I've had to hop a plane today, which is Sunday. I'm going to go ahead and do your lecture. Your lab portion, it will be for you to watch a movie that is on YouTube. And then the following week, the evening class, it was already going to be a independent field trip. The afternoon class, your field trip to the zoo will be an independent trip. They will have your names. You shouldn't have to pay as much to get reimbursed. Remember, both evening and afternoon classes, you need to save. You need to pay in cash and save a receipt. Don't pay for three of you. Pay one person each, get a receipt, and that way I can reimburse you the amount. This week we're going to be looking at biodiversity and endangered species. I just want to say I was impressed by everybody's comments on Aldo Leopold. I'm glad you enjoyed it. For us in this class, we're going to define biodiversity as a result of speciation and extinction occurring over time. And the result of these two processes has been the gradual increase in the number of species. Current estimates place biodiversity as high as 13 to 14 million. Only 1.75 have been described. Before you get overwhelmed with, wow, we haven't described 12.5 million species, realize that most of these are smaller than a pinhead. A lot of these are bacteria. A lot of them are extremely small, almost microscopic insects. A lot of them are very small plants. But there's still a tremendous number of species out there that science still has not described. Why do we care about it? And I think that's important because you hear it a lot, and always there's going to be some of us that are a pragmatic side of all of us that wonders, well, is it really as important? First reason I would say to care about biodiversity is as we learned earlier, in general, the more species, the more stable the ecosystem. So the more species you have, the more stable it will be. There's also two kinds of value to any and all species. First is the instrumental or the pragmatic side. Are they beneficial to humans? We're going to discuss how wild plants and animals are sources for agriculture, forestry, aquaculture, animal husbandry, recreational and aesthetic, scientific value, and then sources of medicine. And then the importance of animals just for their own sake. Do we have the right to make them disappear? Now, sources of agriculture, all the plants that you and I eat, they've been bred by plant geneticists for generations, often going back thousands and thousands of years. For example, this is the original corn. It's not something that you would enjoy over a barbecue. This is what geneticists over thousands of years have bred it to be. Now, this isn't genetics in a test tube. This isn't a GMO. This is just people breeding plants that have bigger seeds, more plump, more juicy, and eventually they end up with this large, tasty ear of corn. To get that, if you go back to our evolution lecture, you've had to reduce a lot of the genetic variability that's in this wild corn plant. So the genetic variability is very narrow in this group. And so the wild plants are often the only genetic bank. And almost 20 years ago, there was a really bad fungus that almost wiped out modern day corn. They were able to go back and cross-pollinate it with the native corn and actually introduce some disease vigor into the corn, and hence you and I can still go to the grocery store and get the corn we need. So a lot of plants need to be saved because they hold the genetic variability, which we've talked about several times in class. It's so important for species that we're directly dependent on for food. Medicines also come primarily from plants. People don't sit around in labs and make up chemicals. They find them in some other source, and almost all medicines have come from plants or animals. Here you see a pretty extensive list: aspirin, codeine, ipecac, polycarpine, pseudoephedrine, quinine, and so on. And all of these came from a wild plant. Now, it's not the entire plant, obviously. You can't go chewing something, but they've identified different chemicals within the plant, and they've been used to save our lives for hundreds of years. Now, with more modern technology, they can take a plant that we might have had to chew 300 years ago, and now we can take a pill instead. So some more moderns was Vincristine from the rosy periwinkle. If we go back here, this is actually a pretty common garden plant right here in Arizona. And this is the Vincristine has been, there's a chemical in that actually cures leukemia. 40 years ago when I was a kid, leukemia was a death sentence, and now a lot of people with leukemia have a much better chance at life than they did just because they found this chemical in the plant. Brazilian viper, which is venomous, they actually found a substance in the venom, capitin, which helps to control high blood pressure. And then this is the most recent one, Taxol from the Pacific yew tree. This is a tree that grows in the North Pacific. When they were logging areas, they used to just cut these trees and let them lay because the wood is very soft. You can't make a board out of it. You can't even make a pencil out of it. It's so soft. So it wasn't anything that loggers were concerned with. It really wasn't on the threatened or endangered list, but it was getting rarer and rarer because people were just cutting them down to get them out of the way to get to the more important pines and oaks and that kind of thing that they could use. About 20 years ago, they determined they found a chemical Taxol in the bark of the Pacific yew tree, and that Taxol is now the primary ingredient used to fight ovarian, breast cancer, and other small cell cancer. So here's a tree that no one thought was important, that now is obviously what we found in it is extremely important to a lot of us. Commercial values are also important. Ecotourism is the largest foreign exchange generating enterprise in many development countries. Probably the first and foremost would be Costa Rica. A lot of the Central American countries, the South American countries are getting into it, Peru, Ecuador. Right here in our own country, $104 billion is spent on wildlife-related recreation. $31 billion is just spent to observe, feed, or photograph wildlife. So if you look at hunting and fishing, for example, hunting and fishing creates about $80 billion in North America for local businesses. You can add another 31 billion of bird watchers. Matter of fact, I have friends from graduate school that are making six figures by taking people bird watching. Arizona is a huge state for that. We have more birds than any state except for California. That's because we don't have a coast. And it's quite popular, and it's really important to a lot of people. So if you were to have grown up in the town of Sierra Vista, outside of Tucson, or in Tucson, some of the small towns in the mountains, Patagonia, Sonoita, Portal, you would know that people coming to see animals is extremely important for the economy of your town. You kind of miss that living in a big city, but trust me, it's very important. Wildlife-related recreation brings in almost twice the amount of money that the NFL does. The NFL is a pretty big business, but not as big as animals. And then, as I mentioned earlier, do species other than humans have inherent rights? I believe they do. Maybe some people don't agree with me, but I think they do. And let me just take a second to discuss something. When we talk about the endangered species, for example, if I were to mention, I want to talk about the importance of a bacteria in the Yellowstone hot springs. I can imagine some of you might be a little, oh, why do we have to care about that? Why do we have to worry about every little bacteria that grows in every little innocuous place? Well, we know a tremendous amount about genetics now and the genome, human genome, and many other species' genome. And the way we've been able to do that, the way they do all the tests they do on CSI for forensic science to determine paternity, that kind of thing, it's a technique called PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. And in polymerase chain reaction, they take a strand of DNA and they heat the strand up to about 100 degrees centigrade. At that time, the bonds breaks, the two strands that are linked up, and then in the solution they have a series of other bases that can create, for example, there's an enzyme that will go along the two separated strands and create another strand. So you start with one, now you have two, then you have four, then you have 8, 16, excuse me, and it goes up exponentially. And they can create millions of strands of DNA in a little over an hour and a half by just heating it up to 100, letting it cool down, heating it up to 100, letting it cool down. The problem is, for almost any animal on Earth, the enzyme polymerase that will rebuild DNA would fall apart if you heated it up to 100 degrees centigrade. The protein would just break down. So what they did is the geneticists went and looked for organisms that might be able to survive that kind of temperature. And one of them they looked at was the bacteria in Yellowstone hot springs, which are about 97 degrees centigrade. They were able to take that polymerase out. They were able to use it. And then since then, they've been able to, and they're commercially making, they call it tag polymerase, and it's the polymerase from the Yellowstone bacteria DNA. So here you have something that, and I can just hear Rush Limbaugh, if somebody before we knew that was concerned about the importance of Yellowstone bacteria. But we can find things that will greatly increase our ability to live, our ability to survive, to live longer, to fix problems that seem to be occurring in the earth in some of the most innocuous places. And it's oftentimes those sources come from chemicals in plants or animals. More often than not, they come from chemicals in plants and animals. We really can't be throwing away things by allowing things to go extinct. You know, an intelligent watchmaker doesn't take a watch apart, throw away a few parts, and put it back together. And that's kind of what we're doing when we allow species to go extinct. If we look at the causes of biodiversity loss, habitat destruction, and this is from your book, it actually is more important than species introductions. However, you're going to learn from watching the film how important species introduction, or what we call invasive species, are. And when we mentioned hunting here, I'm not talking about the kind of hunting we have here in the United States. I'm talking about people just hunting for food, mostly in developed countries, where they're not worried about whether or not they get a big buck. They're just worried about putting meat on the table. And because our human population has just exploded, we're killing way more animals than we used to. And so hunting is having negative effects on some species. Look at physical alteration of habitat. Just right here in our own country, this is pictures from northern Arizona. And we have what's called fragmentation. So we've got these plots of wild land surrounded by farmland. We've got land that will be lost for urbanization, agriculture, deforestation. Some research I was involved with, forest fragmentation, and the problems outlined due to that simplification. This is one that I was involved with right up by Highway 93. And this is Highway 93. going up over to Hoover Dam. And those of you who are older, if you've ever driven across over to Vegas, you know you used to go across Hoover Dam. Well, in the early 90s, I went up I was in charge of a study with 49 radio collar desert bighorn sheep by Hoover Dam. Here's a group crossing the road. And because we knew they were going to build a 4-lane highway, we knew that quite a few animals were getting killed on the former 2-lane highway that was there. And so I essentially lived with these animals for about 3 years. And I came up, and this is an outline of their home ranges, and I came up with some ways that we could allow sheep to either go under this 4-lane road or over the 4-lane road. There's actually a bridge across the road here that bighorn use frequently, very close to where these guys are crossing. And we were able to, if we had split this herd by building a 4-lane highway, we could have really fragmented it. We could have reduced their genetic variability. And you know from our class what could have happened there. But today that's not a concern, because we were able to create some ways that animals were able to go across the road. One of the things I'm most proud of in my career. Simplification is something we've done here in the Southwest because of fire suppression. We've discussed before, we now have this monoculture forest, which is a loss of different successional stages, a very high number of trees. So the animals are trying to adapt to a forest that never really existed before we came. We're also intruding on animals' habitat. Right here in our own country, there's greater than 45,000 cell towers. Unfortunately, they seem to attract migrating birds. It's estimated that 5 to 50 million birds die by hitting them every year. The biggest area of concern, though, is in tropical rainforest. That's where the most species are, and hence when the tropical rainforests are cleared, that's when we lose the most biodiversity. And it is so correlated with the human overpopulation. As humans have increased, recognize this curve? That's a J-shaped curve, isn't it? Now, it's not an S-shaped curve. That's our population, guys. And here's the species that are remaining. And you can see the decline might be as much as 50% by 2050. And that's throwing away a lot of potential medicine and food. And we just got this incredibly exploding population. I barely touched on all the reasons why. It's harder doing a lecture by tape than it is in class. But you can see that humans increasing and species decreasing is 100% correlated. You look at the biodiversity hotspots, most of it is in the tropics. And 60% of our biodiversity is located on just 1.4% of the Earth's land surface. And unfortunately, that's usually where there's very high numbers of people. And the people are overpopulated. They have no other choice but to use the environment for food, for shelter. And so you have an issue. And that's a tough one to deal with. And we'll be dealing with that when I get back. So why do we care about it? Why do we care about the extinction crisis? None of you saw a dinosaur today, and if you have, then maybe you should go see a doctor. But so obviously we've had animals going extinct for a long period of time. And the reason why we need to be concerned about it is the speed and then the amount of animals going extinct. And this is from the Smithsonian Institute. The background level of extinction known from fossils is about 1 species per million per year. So if you take a group of animals like mammals, about one species of mammal will go extinct per million per year. Between 10 and 100 species per year, including all organisms such as insect, bacteria, fungi, not just the large vertebrates we're most familiar with. In contrast, estimates based on the rate at which tropical rainforests are being reduced to large numbers of specialized species We may lose 27,000 species per year to extinction. We're going to lose a species to extinction in the time that I give this lecture. We might lose 2. That is not typical. That is not the past extinction rate. So because there's so many more humans and because we're putting so much more on habitat destruction, we're moving species around. They now live where they don't belong. We've got huge problems. So let's look at mammals that most of us like the most. The typical rate of extinction differs from different groups. Mammals, for instance, have an average species lifespan from origination to extinction of about 1 million years. So on average, a species lives, thrives, and then goes extinct about 1 million years. Some will persist as long as 10 million. It could be argued that humans have persisted for about 3 million. There are about 5,000 known mammalian species alive at the present. Most of them have been described by 99.9% of it. The average species lifespan for mammals, the background extinction rate, would be approximately 1 species every 200 years. Some centuries might see more than 1. Other centuries would not see any. However, in the past 400 years, we've seen 89 mammalian extinctions. The norm would be 2, that's 5 times the predicted rate, and another 169 mammal species are listed as critically endangered. So if somebody asks you why worry about extinction, it's always happened. It's because now it's happening so fast, and it's almost all due to our pressure on the environment. In our own state, we have 59 threatened or endangered species. This is the Colorado pike minnow, which we'll learn about later in the semester. I actually learned this guy was extinct. This is a black-footed ferret. And when I was at the University of Wyoming, we learned that they were an extinct species. They found them about 4 years after I graduated. They put them into a controlled breeding, and then we've been releasing them, and we now have over a few thousand in the United States, but they have to be very closely monitored. Game and Fish does some ferret surveys and capture every spring and fall. It was great fun for me to go on some of those and actually catch a species that I learned was extinct. It made me feel great. But we do have a lot of threatened and endangered species in a lot of our fish. Another reason that species are going extinct is pollution. We've already learned about the dead zone. Climate change may really affect polar bears. Oil spills have affected several species and caused some to go extinct. The movie you're going to watch is on the exotic species, 39% current losses due to extinction. Game fishes in Arizona, 19 of our 32 species of fishes in Arizona are endangered, primarily because they're competing with exotic fish. Salt cedar, if you were to drive down the Gila River, if you even know where it is, you would find that it's most of the vegetation is salt cedar. It's not the native trees. Brazilian pepper trees are the same way. The brown tree snake is a snake that evolves on just a couple islands in the South Pacific. It makes its living in trees, and it's been moved to different islands because the birds on these islands didn't evolve with a tree crawling snake. They're not aware of that kind of predation impact, and these trees are just wiping out bird species on every island that they find themselves. Our own starlings here in town, they're European. They're not from here. They're pushing woodpeckers out at a pretty high rate, and it's pretty disturbing. Overuse by humans. Again, this is not managed hunting, but we're going to have somebody give a issue report on whaling. Trading exotics such as rhinos. Rhinos, let me take just a second. Rhinos, this is a white rhino because it has a square mouth. A black rhino would have more of a pointed mouth. Black rhinos are probably a few thousand left at most. White rhinos maybe just about 10,000. And they're killing 1,000 a year for the horn. The horn's worthless, but in some East Asian cultures, they believe that it does cure diseases. And therefore there's a huge market in it. and people are really willing to risk their lives because they make nothing. They can get 4 to 5 years salary by going out and killing one rhino and selling the horn, so they're willing to do it. In our own country, black bear gallbladders, elk horns, and when they're in velvet, people kill them and they grind them up and into powder and sell them to East Asian cultures. Tiger bones, the same thing. It makes you macho. Parrot smuggling is a big issue. Animals taken out of the tropics and brought, and unfortunately, usually somewhere between 1 out of every 15 to 20 parrots that's actually imported survives. The other ones die. Cactus theft in our own state can be an issue. The species' natural history can also directly relate to its current risk. Species like brown bears, they're still doing great in Canada and Alaska where people live, but when people start moving there, they tend to get rid of bears. They tend to get rid of wolves because these animals might kill them or they'll kill their livestock. Animals that migrate, think of a bird. I mean, they not only have to have their summer range habitat protected, they need to have their winter range and all the areas they stop over protected. Very, very hard to manage for that, and that's why we have a lot of what they call neotropical migrants, birds that go from the temperate areas in the United States down to the tropics and then back. A lot of them are declining at an alarming rate, and not so much because we're losing the habitat in the United States. We're losing it in countries that are underdeveloped, and the people are cutting down the jungle just to survive. Animals that have really specific food or shelter requirements are much more in risk for endangers. Animals that are very sensitive to things like temperature changes are much more susceptible to become critically endangered, go extinct. Species with a low growth potential, in other words, they don't have a lot of young during their life, they're more in danger of going threatened. And species that are obviously naturally rare for reasons other than humans. We haven't caused every problem, but we've caused most of them. A keystone species, you need to understand what this is. And I'm going to take the sea otter, or no, let's take the starfish first. This was the one that was first described as a keystone species, and this guy named Payne, what he did on the Washington coast is he went into the tidal zones and he measured the number of animals, for example, found in a square meter, which is this picture here. And normally he would find, if he counted up the algae and the mussels and the starfish and the other invertebrates, about 37 species per square meter. Well, then he went through and he went and fenced areas of the intertidal zone, and he took all the starfish out because the starfish are the top predator. And by removing the top predator, the species numbers actually went from 37 to 1 to 2, because a mussel called Mytilus, which is a mussel you might enjoy eating, it's a black mussel, will outcompete all these other 33 or 34 species and totally take over this intertidal zone. Well, starfish eat Mytilus, so they keep them at a level that other species can survive in this area, and that's what it's always been. So by removing a keystone species, then they don't have to be the largest, they don't have to be the strongest, but they have. A keystone species is an animal that has a real exertion over other species, real effect on other species in the ecosystem. Here's a prairie dog. They dig up the dirt, which allows the dirt to be loose. Grass can grow better in the areas of prairie dogs than it does. They're a keystone species. Mountain lions, being a top predator, are often a keystone species. So another one I want to talk about, the sea otter. The sea otter eats several things. It eats abalone, but it also eats sea urchins. And sea urchins graze on kelp. Well, kelp beds are an extremely important community in the ocean. And sea otters keep urchin populations down by eating the urchins. When the sea otters were almost totally wiped out due to the fur trade, because this little guy here has about 800 million hairs on his body, so the only way he can survive in this water. They have very good fur, best fur known for reducing heat. Kelp beds began to disappear, and that's because the sea otters were gone. The urchins would eat the kelp, and the kelp would just float away. So we lost kelp beds, which is important to over 200 species of fish. The sea otters came back, urchins disappeared, kelp beds came back. Now we've got a problem, though, in that the sea lion population is down. So their predator, killer whales, are now moved to a smaller prey, sea otters, and once again we're losing kelp beds. Not an easy answer as to what's going on or why things are going on the way they are. But keystone species are extremely important. Some groups concerned with preserving biodiversity are the International Union Conservation Network, CITES, which controls the trade of endangered species, and Convention on Biological Diversity. If we look at endangered species in the U.S., 67 species are apparently secure, 1% presumed extinct, 7 critically imperiled, 8 imperiled, 16% vulnerable. So we have quite a few species that even in what I consider the most conservation-oriented country in the world, that are still in concern. It's a problem with the Endangered Species Act. It's not easy to administer. The number of plant and animal species and or subspecies extinct in North America since the arrival of the Pilgrim is 500. The number of U.S. species listed, threatened and endangered, 617. The number of species that have been removed due to successful recovery, 6. The number removed because they are now extinct, 7. So we're batting about a little less than 500. Number of listed plants with improving population, 26. Declining populations, 97. Listed animals with improving, 33. Listed animals with declining populations, 122. Number of plant species facing extinction in the U.S. in the next 5 years, 253. At the current listing rate, how long would it take to consider all animals that are believed to be in trouble is greater than 50 years? You know, it's a good thing that it's hard to put a species on the endangered species list because it's a big hammer. It can affect people on their private land. It can affect you. So it's a big hammer. It's the biggest tool that any conservationist has, and it shouldn't be used lightly, at least in my opinion. I don't think we need to blanketly put every species under an Endangered Species Act. Some people disagree with me. But every time an animal population reduces, it doesn't mean they're going extinct. My reason for fearing that, if you're wondering why, is that if you use that big hammer too much, Congress will take it away from you. I mean, I'm a realist, and if you use that hammer, again, Endangered Species Act is it can control what people do on the land. If you use it too much, you'll lose it. So I use it cautiously, or at least I'm a believer in using it cautiously. This is the number of mammals, birds, reptiles that are covered, and you can look at this more at your leisure on your PowerPoint. Major problem with Endangered Species Act is financial. For example, fiscal year 2011, the budget for endangered species management was $140 million. You may think that's a lot, but if you just start looking at government expenditures, you realize that can get lost between the Congress floor and the bathroom. $140 million is almost nothing. Unfortunately, that incurs large earmarks for special species like the wolves, and along with some national park issues. That's $140 million is less than it costs to make a movie, or less than it costs to make 1 mile of urban highway, or any one of the jets at Luke Air Force Base. Well, that's it. I wish I had been there and I could have expanded on some of those things, but it's very difficult to do. Today, I want you to watch the YouTube video. I'm going to have some questions that go along with it that you need to answer and email to me. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for excusing me, although you didn't really have a choice. I'm sorry I'm not there, but I'm sure you understand that I couldn't be there given my current conditions. Thank you.